Welcome to the EPRS Chronicles for the second episode on our series on corruption. In episode 1, we looked at the definition of corruption as well as how to measure something that by its nature is very hard to measure. In episode 2, we will discuss the cost of corruption as well as to what extent it can be tackled at EU level. For this, I am joined once more by Piotr Bąkowski, EPRS policy analyst specialized in criminal law. Hello, Piotr.
Hello.
So let's look now at the economic costs of corruption. Can you tell us how we estimate them?
Well, you know, the social, economic and political costs of corruption are undoubtedly very high. But the European Parliamentary Research Service has made an attempt at putting figures at it. And a report published in 2016 estimated that corruption cost the EU between around 180 and 990 billion euro every year. That's quite a spread, but the actual level depends on what is feasible for member states in terms of reducing corruption. Now, if you take corruption in public procurement alone, it costs EU member states around 30 billion euros every year.
That's quite a high sum. So what is the European Union doing to fight corruption?
Dealing with corruption is primarily a national competence, yet the EU has developed its own legal framework to address this problem. And it has started with crimes affecting EU financial interests. But with time, with the treaty reforms, it has become possible for the EU to address a variety of aspects of corruption. So now we have, laws on whistleblowers, on money laundering, as well as a series of public procurement directives dealing with transparency in public procurement. There is one specific possibility under the Lisbon Treaty that we have not made use of yet. Corruption is one of Eurocrimes, for which the EU may adopt directives, minimum rules on sanctions and definitions of crime. This has been already done for other forms of crime. In order to know what anti-corruption efforts are being taken across the EU, we need monitoring mechanisms. Such mechanisms exist at international level. For example, Councils of Europe, Greco. The EU has also its own mechanisms, which are part of the EU rule of law toolbox.
And I'd like to get into some of the specifics. You mentioned money laundering just recently. How does the EU tackle that?
There has been a series of EU anti-money laundering directives, and they have put various obligations on banks, but not only, also on a variety of financial and non-financial institutions, such as, for example, real estate agents. They have to know their clients, and they have to report suspicious transactions they come across. There are also central registers in which so-called beneficial owners' names are put. So you cannot hide behind an opaque business structure. Your name has to be known.
And regarding whistleblowers, you mentioned them earlier. We also talked a little bit about the fear of coming out and reporting corruption in episode 1. What is the EU doing to protect whistleblowers?
Well, there is a directive, an EU directive, which specifically addresses that problem. It has been enforced since 2019. It provides whistleblowers with secure channels for reporting, as well as protecting them against retaliation by their employers, for example. However, this directive has not been transposed by all member states. It hasn't been translated into all national laws, which means that whistleblower protection is uneven across the EU.
Zooming in on the institutions now, are there bodies whose role it is to fight corruption?
Indeed, there are bodies that deal specifically with that. OLAF, European Anti-Fraud Office, is one such body, which runs investigations into cases of fraud and corruptions involving EU funds, as well as cases of serious misconduct in the EU institutions. OLAF only runs administrative investigations. It doesn't have a power to force member states' law enforcement or judicial authorities into a certain course of action. It can only make recommendations. I have looked into recent data by OLAF concerning OLAF investigations, and for you to have an idea of how active it is, in 2021 it has launched well over 200 investigations, and it has recommended the recovery of EU funds for around €500 million. Now there is another institution that can run prosecutions into corruption cases. The EPPO, a newly established European Public Prosecutor's Office. EPPO has been active since last year, and almost as soon as it started, it launched a major corruption case.
Speaking of institutions, I also want to ask you about something that was mentioned by the President of the European Commission. President von der Leyen said in her State of the European Union address that in 2023, the Commission would propose measures to update the anti-corruption legislative framework. So why do you think it's a priority for the European Union to be doing more on corruption right now?
Well, I believe COVID-19 has definitely created a new context here because, with all the emergency funding of unprecedented volume that has been put in place, we really need to make sure that we use the instruments that we already have in the right way and maybe reflect on whether new instruments wouldn't be needed. The Parliament has adopted a specific resolution on this post-COVID situation. Now, as I've already mentioned, we have a range of tools already at hand. We have to make sure that they're transposed, that they're implemented and enforced across the EU. There is more coming, as you said. Among the Commission's proposals, there are minimum rules on sanctions and crimes, definitions of crime in the area of corruption. So the anti-corruption directive may finally see the light of day. Overall, the problem of corruption will not disappear. We'll always face it, and we have to make sure that we coordinate the action of all those who are involved in combating corruption. At the same time, we have to make sure that the loopholes we identify are filled.
Okay, so quite a lot to do still.
Indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Piotr. This has been very enlightening overall.
Thank you.
To find out more about corruption in the EU, please visit the EPRS website.